Alrighty. It's Professor Buzzkill here, busting myths, taking names, ruining your day since the early 60s. Here we are talking about history and especially about World War II. And who better to join us in the Buzzkill bunker than Professor Philip Nash from Penn State, who's our 20th century historian and our military historian and our diplomatic historian. But more importantly, he's your favorite historian. Professor, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
You know, we talk so much about the big highlight events in World War II in Europe. Everybody knows about D-Day. Everybody knows about Montgomery and El Alamein. Everybody knows something about Patton, all that kind of stuff. Battle of the Bulge. People watched Band of Brothers, all sorts of things. There are so many things missing. And fortunately, very, very fortunately, you have come with an idea to talk about the Tunisia campaign of 1942-43.
Right. Or to talk about I'll put it this way, to talk about the half of the North African campaign that doesn't get as much attention as El Alamein and Montgomery's Eighth Army. Right. And to finish the picture, like how is North Africa finally conquered by the Allies?
Right, which even I didn't know well enough. So set the stage, please.
I will do that. So basically, we're talking about North Africa, but really what's at stake is control of the Mediterranean. Because remember, Hitler's junior partner, Italy, sticks down in the Mediterranean, and control of the Mediterranean in the early part of World War II is, shall we say, contested at best. So why does control of the Mediterranean? Keep in mind that the British control the points at the ends, like the Suez Canal and Gibraltar.
Right, at the west and the east, yeah.
But they can't ship stuff through the Mediterranean because the Italians and the German Air Force and everything else are in the way. And it's very complicated, right? You have, like, for example, the amazing struggle of the island of Malta to avoid being taken over by the Axis. In any case, so control of North Africa will give you control of the Mediterranean, certainly when it comes to shipping. And what that also means, let's keep in mind, the big picture geography is that if you don't control the Mediterranean and you want to ship stuff between, say, India and the British Isles, you have to go around Africa.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a logistical nightmare. So there are these sorts of issues at stake. And also, and then once you control the North African littoral, you can then use it as a base from which to attack north into Italy, which is going to happen next.
Right, which is what happened. So this peripheral campaign that everyone talks about early in the war is what sort of needs to happen.
Correct. And let me just, since this is not a visual program, but an audio program, let me just remind the listeners of the geography here. So from west to east in North Africa, we're talking about Morocco, which is over in the west,
right,
and on the Atlantic, as well as facing Gibraltar across the strait there. Then Algeria, then Tunisia, it's sort of the northern tip of North Africa, and then you dip down into Libya, and then you go east to Egypt, right? So Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. There's your geography lesson for the day. Like I said, the British control Gibraltar and Malta and Cyprus and Suez Canal, but the Italians, by the way, have a very large and very effective navy. Their army, I think, obviously is not quite as effective, but their navy is not bad. And then, of course, there's also the Luftwaffe, which is operating from Italian bases. They have an enormous reach. And there are also German U-boats prowling the Mediterranean.
Yeah, we think of them as an Atlantic thing. No, and it's also a Mediterranean thing.
Worth remembering. There are all sorts of U-boats operating from southern France and from Italian ports. And it gets worse from the Allies because at this point in the war, 1941, 42, Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia are controlled by the Vichy French, right? The German puppet state in southern France. So
as the movie Casablanca lets us know.
Exactly. If you've seen Casablanca, you know exactly what we're talking about. So from 1940 to 42, there was this famous seesaw struggle over in the eastern half of North Africa, right? Fighting between British Egypt and Italian Libya, right? And with the Germans intervened to save the Italians, and that's where Rommel earned his stripes. And you had this famous back and forth that went on for years. Mm-hmm. Big picture, sort of a secondary theater, but it was the only place where the Commonwealth forces were engaged in the Germans on the ground, and so it got a lot of attention, and that's why Rommel got a lot of attention. We did an episode about him a long, long time ago. Learn more about him.
By the way, driving home from New York last week, I listened to both the Rommel episode again, the Rommel myth episode again. Absolutely fascinating. You're a genius, Professor.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, that was a fun episode to do. So, happily for the Allies, late October, early November 1942, Montgomery's Eighth Army finally prevails at El Alamein, forces Rommel's Africa Corps to retreat from Egypt. They begin this long retreat that's going to last for months back through Italy toward Tunisia. And the timing turns out to be very, very good because it happened. It takes place just a few days before the launching of Operation Torch, which is the invasion of Northwest Africa, which is what I'm going to focus on in a minute.
All right. So what was the basic Allied strategy?
So, and I think we may have alluded to this at least in another episode, but just to remind folks, at this point, 1942, there's an enormous disagreement between U.S. and British planners about how to go about taking down the Axis in Europe. U.S. military planners favored a cross-channel invasion, so across the English Channel from the U.K. into France as soon as possible, if possible, in 1942. Their idea was sort of go for the jugular, right? Engage the Germans close to Germany and have a showdown with them there. They were very wary of what the British so-called, you mentioned it, the sort of peripheral strategy, where you nibble around the edges, you don't take on the Germans head on because you can't manage it. They're suspicious of that, partly because they suspect, and they're not entirely wrong, they suspect that what's going on here is the British, sort of a British strategy of empire preservation as opposed to war winning. The British, of course, were worried about casualties. Unlike the Americans, the British had suffered, I'll put it this way, the British suffered mightily compared to the Americans in World War I. They had much more firsthand knowledge of how formidable German military strength was. And their attitude was you do what you can do. Like I said, this peripheral strategy, you nibble around the edges, you take on the weaker ally, Italy, you rely on your naval blockade and your strategic bombing, and you knock out Italy first and expose, as Churchill famously said, the soft underbelly of the Axis, which turned out to be one of the great misnomers of the Second World War, as we'll find out.
The Italian campaign
as we'll find out.
Not exactly soft.
Yeah. I think later on, was it the World War? They referred to it as tough old gut, which is a much better analogy. In any case, the idea was you North Africa, then Italy, and take out the junior partner and cause Hitler problems that way. So we had this major disagreement.
By the way, Buzzcutters, this is a genuine disagreement between two major allies. You know, lots of armies in world history and military history use a peripheral strategy, called a Fabius Maximus strategy.
Right, or an attrition strategy.
George Washington did it against the British. And so it's not necessarily some British weakness or fear. It is a genuine military.
You can argue it's more realistic, and also,
Right.
like everyone, you strategize based on your experience.
Yeah.
You can make a really good argument that that's what won World War I. It was a war of attrition, and you wore the Germans down until they collapsed.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you try that again? Especially if in the process you can minimize your own casualties. So,
anyway, I interrupted you there.
No, it's okay. So the British proposed Operation Torch, which was you invade the relatively lightly held by the Vichy French forces, Northwest Africa. And then if you time it right, if Montgomery's army in Egypt defeats Rommel at roughly the same time, then you basically catch him in a pincer. And you're moving from Northwest Africa and Northeast Africa at the same time, and you can pinch the Germans in the middle and thus conquer North Africa that way. That's the British model. So securing all of North Africa would be a huge step towards securing the Mediterranean, as I said a minute ago, a launch pad for invasion of Italy. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, he's got his own sort of take on all of this. His attitude is you need to get the American public's head into the war against the Germans, which was an issue. And by the way, they had opinion polling. He could read the newspapers. He knew that by the summer of 1942, Americans were focused primarily on the war in the Pacific, right? Midway, Guadalcanal, right? Those major battles taking place. People still fired up by Pearl Harbor, right? That's where Americans, their hearts are and their heads are too. And he worries about that. He wants to remind people that we are fighting against the Germans. And of course, the best way to do that is to get American forces blooded against the Germans on the ground.
Right.
And then the question is, well, and then how do you do that in 1942, right? He worries that if you go with the American generals and you do a cross-channel invasion, and if you're not ready to do it, it gets postponed until later, which, of course, as we'll see, would happen in any case.
And there's an argument that American troops weren't ready for that.
There's that, right. Which, of course, the American military planners are loath to admit. Maybe Roosevelt was a little more realistic in that sense as well. I think it turned out to be, as I'll say, it turned out to be the right decision. But in any case, the strategic debate is solved when Roosevelt sides with the British and overrules his own generals, which a lot of them do not take very well, as you might imagine. But he is the commander-in-chief. He sides with London. He gets behind the plan for Operation Torch, a late 1942 invasion of French-held Northwest Africa. He puts the relatively junior general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in command of the operation. He's plucked from relative obscurity. There were literally hundreds of higher-ranked American generals who thought that they deserved to run this before Dwight Eisenhower did.
Oh, hundreds. Really?
Literally
that
hundreds.
amazes me.
Yeah, and partly this has to do with the genius of George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who recognized who recognized Eisenhower's talent between 1939 and Pearl Harbor. So the plan, like I said, was a pincer. You secure all of North Africa, the entire southern coast of the Mediterranean, by squeezing the Germans out from west and east simultaneously. I mean, in sort of strategy 101, this is classic, right? The classic pincer move from both sides at once.
Right.
Multiply the Germans' problems and force them out of North Africa. And like I said, the timing was perfect. Monty's victory in El Alamein is late October, early November 1942, almost exactly coincides with Operation Torch, which takes place on the 8th of November, 1942.
All right. So now we're at Operation Torch itself, right at that date. How did the invasion go?
Sure. By the way, as a military undertaking, as an enormous scale amphibious operation, this only doesn't get attention because of D-Day.
Oh.
Because D-Day is bigger and more impressive. If it weren't for D-Day, I guarantee you we would know more about it as a sort of a general sort of public interest in history.
Yeah.
This was the largest amphibious invasion ever up until that point. And by the way, they learned a lot of things from this that helped make subsequent landings go a little more smoothly. And I didn't say smoothly. I said a little more smoothly. You're going to have especially on the next episode, we'll talk about Sicily, for example, where there's all sorts of mayhem. But this was a massive undertaking. So it includes task forces, naval task forces, which are delivering these troops and their equipment and their supplies and everything else, and the naval gunfire support, et cetera. These multiple task forces are leaving from the United Kingdom and the United States at the same time.
Wow.
So the Western Task Force basically has to sail across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Which was dicey because the war against the U-boats has not been won yet.
No.
You know, and the torpedoing of a single troop ship could be disastrous. And so you have to coordinate these things, right? You have to make sure something leaving Norfolk, Virginia arrives in North Africa at the same time as stuff leaving from Great Britain. So there's a lot of sort of management and sort of coordination that goes into this. The Western Task Force, the one sailing from the United States, it alone encompassed 100 naval craft.
Wow.
The big issue facing this invasion was, will the French fight? Like I said, Vichy France was a German ally, was a puppet state. Was a puppet state. Just to keep in mind, and this gets into the whole resistance myth thing. As of 1942, most French did not side with de Gaulle in the Free French.
Yes, absolutely. You're right.
Most French sided with, to the extent they sided with anyone, sided with Vichy France. There was still, by the way, a huge resentment directed at the British. But then the question is, how would they fight? How, if they did fight against the Americans and the British and other Allied forces, how vigorously would they fight? They didn't know. There were pre-invasion talks with people like the Vichy Admiral Darlan, and this, among other things, became a political issue because the secret talks with Darlan were revealed to the public at the time, and there was a big blowback because this looked like negotiating with the enemy. The problem with Darlan was solved, I believe, around Christmas 1942 when he was assassinated.
Yeah. That's sort of...
I'm sorry. It's not terribly funny, but it did solve one political problem for the Allies.
Yeah.
In any case, the Western Task Force, which was U.S. forces, would land in Morocco in and around Casablanca. Mm-hmm. The Central Task Force, which was the U.S. forces primarily, would land in the middle in Algeria in and around Oran. And then the Eastern Task Force, which was British forces, would land. So this is the farthest east of the three landing areas. Would land in Algiers, in Algeria, of course. Generally, the landings went pretty well. There were only, and I say only in quotation marks, only about 1,000 Allied dead in the entire invasion, which, big picture, if you look at what could have gone wrong, the difficulty of amphibious operations, et cetera, that's a pretty low body count. But it's worth reminding, and by the way, some things went very poorly. I think it was Oran, where they tried to seize the port at night without firing a shot, just like silently sailed into the port and tried to grab it. And the French resisted, and they essentially wiped out the invasion force. Hundreds of Americans lost their lives. It was a disaster.
At the hands of the French.
At the hands of the French, yeah, the hands of the French Navy, who had defended the port rather vigorously. So there were some little disasters here and there, like that one. But it's worth reminding, if you ask people, like, well, who do you think the Americans fought against first in Europe? They'd all look at you like you were insane and say, well, the Germans. No, the answer is the French. The American forces first fought against French forces in the European theater. So the Allies land, they establish their beachheads, and they head east toward Tunisia. In the early phase, so November, December 1942, the front was often in flux. So basically what's happening is the Germans start to rush forces into Tunisia from Sicily, across that strait there, and then push west, hoping to get as far west as possible. And the Allies are rushing east, trying to get in Tunisia as quickly as possible. Right. And the front line was in flux. I have to tell you this one story, because this sort of thing does not happen very often. It doesn't as you might imagine, it doesn't happen very often in warfare where your ground forces get to attack enemy air forces on the ground.
Huh. No.
It has happened before. By the way, it happened after Stalingrad when the Germans were in retreat and it was in horrible winter conditions. Some Soviet tank forces managed to roll up into the middle of a German airfield. And as you can imagine, that sort of thing typically doesn't go very well for the air forces involved, right? I mean, think about it, right? You always keep your air bases, even your forward air bases, are safely behind your front line.
Right.
Because they're defenseless against ground forces. In any case, this is one indication of how much this front was in flux, that in late November, there was a U.S. light tank company. This is about 17 tanks.
Right.
Who were scouting down this road, down a valley. It was untouched, no Germans in the area. And they noticed that these German aircraft were taking off from just the other side of this ridge they were driving alongside.
Yeah.
And so one of the tanks drove up to take a look. And the scout tank came back down and said there was a German airfield on the other side of the ridge, basically unguarded. They didn't even have sentries posted.
Amazing.
And so this junior officer, he radioed this to his commanding officer and asked, well, what should I do? And the superior said, and I'm quoting, "For God's sake, attack them. Go after them." You know, if you're in a tank crew, this is like Christmas.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not even Christmas. This is like the second coming. It's like this never happens. You never get this sort of opportunity in combat. So 17 tanks, they crested the hill, and then they sped down the other side, and then had an absolute field day shooting up the place. Setting all the ammunition and the fuel on fire, machine gunning all these planes, some of them as they were trying to take off.
Yeah.
You know, and the Germans were defenseless. And, you know, there were German pilots who were like zigzagging on foot down the runway who got shot down like dogs. I mean, it was a slaughter. They wiped out maybe 24 German aircraft on the ground. You know, and there's one point there was a tank that just drove down this line of parked aircraft, like shearing off all the tails. I mean, you can imagine as a tank crewman, this is like, it doesn't get any better than this.
Yeah.
So it's a bad day for the Luftwaffe, as you might imagine. In any case, this didn't change the outcome of the battle or anything. It's just sort of an interesting side story. But a long story short is the Allies had hoped to rush into Tunisia and gain the major port there, Bizerte, and the capital city, Tunis, sort of by just a lightning thrust, and they failed. They failed to gain a swift victory, and then you ended up with basically a stalemate.
So why did they fail? Why didn't things work out?
Right. Why didn't this happen? There were lots and lots of reasons. One, in case I forget, was just poor planning, and you see this in other parts of World War II on both sides, where you fixate on the big problem, and you do that so much you lose track of the other problems. So, for example, in this case, the complexity of pulling off the torch landings gets all the attention, and the post-invasion planning got very little attention.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, okay, we landed and it was successful. Now what? Oh, well, now we just sort of like make it up as we go along and head east.
Yeah, yikes.
So that was one problem. Another problem is that it turns out they landed too far west. It turns out it was too great a distance to cover at speed. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles, certainly from Casablanca. The distance from Casablanca to Tunisia is, I have to look it up, but it's significant. North Africa is large. The distances are great.
Oh, yeah.
So, and the distance also matters because these forces, once they start to head east, they quickly outrun their air cover. There were no Allied air bases far enough east to support the ground forces. And so if people have seen the movie Patton, which is, of course, this great cultural touchstone, early in the movie when Patton arrives in North Africa, he's constantly being shot at by the German Air Force.
Yeah, because they're there and the Allies aren't.
And because the Germans still have control of the air. And that's true early in the campaign. The Germans had control of the air. They rushed their air assets into Tunisia quickly, and the front line is very close to them, whereas the Allied air faces are, in some cases, hundreds of miles to the west, which means that Allied air forces, even if they can make it over the battlefield, they can't stay there very long. Mm-hmm. So the Allies failed to gain control of the air, and that costs them dearly in the early months. Even more simply, number two, the Axis buildup in Tunisia was too fast. Hitler committed significant forces to shoring up the front in Tunisia. And from the Axis standpoint, it's one of the great ironies of this. He sends significant forces into Tunisia, several divisions, including several crack divisions, the sort of stuff that Rommel would have loved to have had in the summer of 1942, with which who knows, he might have actually taken the Suez Canal. But his forces had been starved of reinforcements and equipment and ammunition. And so now, so you can argue in the big picture that Hitler is a day late and a dollar short, but he does make a significant commitment, and you see this throughout the history of the European theater. The Germans, they're typically faster. They have their stuff together. They're more aggressive. They're more assertive. They're better organized. They move quickly. When they decide to do something, they do it. And often it seems like when the Allies decide to do something, there's always dithering. There's always, oh well, we have to take our time to do this, etc.
Interesting.
And you see it here too. So there are other factors. The weather in places like Europe, including North Africa, the weather can often play a role. This is winter in Tunisia. There's rain and snow and mud, which slows down your vehicles and your tanks. The terrain combines with the weather. Terrain is another factor. Tunisia is in North Africa. It's not like Egypt or Libya. It's not this a pool table made out of sand. Not even close. It is very, very rugged. Lots of rocky, sharp hills and deep valleys and sort of gulches. A lot of this very easily defensible. And the Axis, as the Allies find out the hard way, are very skilled in defense. And then finally, on the Allied side, especially when it comes to the 4 American divisions that were deployed, a lot of the troops inadequately trained, inexperienced. A lot of them are poorly led. And keep in mind, the U.S. forces, with a couple of exceptions in the interwar period, haven't been in combat since World War I, right? A lot of some of your senior officers have not had much combat experience. And there's nothing like combat to find out who's good in combat and who isn't.
Right.
And that's just a sort of a truism about warfare. But a lot of these troops, as we'll see, were poorly led. So to give an example of what kind of impact this can have, early in the campaign in particular, and especially American officers, mid-ranked officers, suffered very, very high casualties. Lots of officers killed and wounded. And if you're wondering, why is that? It's because of the poor performance of the troops generally, they often had to go to the front to sort things out. And to get people to do their jobs and to get their orders followed properly, you have to go up and intervene personally.
Yeah.
If your lower ranked officers and NCOs and troops are doing their jobs, you don't have to do that, and then you don't have to risk your life. Right. But if lieutenants and captains and colonels have to keep going to the front to sort things out, they're going to get shot. So that's sort of, I think, very sort of a telling indication of some of the problems here. So a lot of the commanding officers were, like I said, plodding, slow, timid. They failed to concentrate their forces, right? Would have their forces spread out rather than concentrate at the point of attack. And also, finally, this in the same category, I'd put what you'd call poor combined arms tactics. This is something else that often you only acquire in actual combat. How do you coordinate the different branches, the different arms of your forces so they work together? Right?
Okay.
Right. How do you coordinate what your Army Air Forces are doing in the air with what you're doing on the ground? How do you coordinate your artillery and your infantry? How do you coordinate your infantry and your armor?
Yeah.
These are units that often train by themselves, and then they're thrown into combat, and they don't know how to work together effectively. And you have breakdowns in communication, right? You have misunderstandings. You have different ways of doing things. And combat, once again, that's not where you want to find out that you're not very good at that.
No, not at all.
So the front stabilizes. You end up with a stalemate that lasts for months rather than weeks. It ends a real slugfest, fairly high casualties. And this period, I'm not going to go through the details. That would just bore the listeners. But it lasts well into March 1943. And the Americans have much to learn. Once again, I'll reference our famous movie Patton again. People may recall Patton. The movie Patton begins with Patton showing up in the aftermath of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the Americans have basically gotten their butts kicked. It was a horrible defeat. It was one of the worst defeats the U.S. forces suffered, certainly in Europe, in World War II, where Rommel counterattacked Americans who were poorly led, who were spread out, poorly coordinated, and really gave the Americans a bloody nose. They almost drove the Americans back into Algeria with this offensive, which finally the defense stiffened and Rommel had to withdraw, but obviously Rommel still had some skills. He had superior forces in terms of the sort of troop quality, coordination, including and also some of the weapons. So you see some of the problems. By the way, Eisenhower had been asked back in January, I believe, by FDR when FDR came out to Africa for the Casablanca conference, where he met with Churchill. in January 1943. Roosevelt asked Eisenhower, how long do you think this is going to take? By this point, the stalemate had set in, and they had not achieved their initial goal of seizing Tunisia quickly. And Eisenhower's response was, I think it's going to take until about mid-May, which turned out to be right on the money. Like it was actually, he was just pulling that out of his behind. But that he was right on the money in terms of how long this was actually going to take.
Well, then how did the Allies turn things around?
How did they turn things around, right? You all know they did end up winning the campaign for North Africa, right? Yeah. And so there was a whole list of factors. One is that the top brass, the senior commanders, they start to learn on the job. Eisenhower himself, by the way, if you look, I've read a big fat biography of once by a military historian who gave him relatively low marks for the North African campaign.
Huh.
Just in terms of his management, his sort of what is sometimes called grip, right? Like, are you in charge, right? Are you executing your authority? Are people do people want to follow you? Do you have a sense of the big picture and all the moving parts? It takes him a while to acquire that. It takes him a while to learn how to ride his subordinates. He's far too tolerant of incompetence beneath him early in the campaign. He quickly gets bogged down in trivia and sort of micromanagement. That's another skill you have to learn, right? Find good people and delegate to them. That takes a while. They had to undertake some command restructuring. Like I said, the sort of sorting out that only combat can provide. The most famous on the American side, among the American forces, the most infamous case is the Second Corps commander. So the main Allied unit fighting in Tunisia, well, there are two. There's Montgomery's 8th Army coming up in the south of Tunisia from Libya, and then there's the British 1st Army commanded by Kenneth Anderson. And within the British 1st Army, there is the U.S. 2nd Corps. That's where those 4 divisions are. The U.S. 2nd Corps was commanded by Lloyd Friedendahl. People should go read about Lloyd Friedendahl. He was a disaster.
Yeah.
So he was one of these interwar commanders who just sort of worked his way up through the ranks, and then in combat proved his incompetence. This is someone who detailed enormous numbers of combat engineers to basically bore out tunnels in a mountainside way back from the front to build him a bunker.
Yeah.
It's it's really bizarre. I guess he was sort of like obsessed with his own personal security. But among other things, it meant he was way, way too far behind the line and out of touch with his subordinate commanders. He had his forces spread out, which is one of the reasons why they were clobbered at Kasserine Pass. Anyway, so he was replaced by George Patton. Patton, by the way, commanded the Western Task Force, but he was not given a command on the ground in North Africa until he replaced Lloyd Friedendahl.
Okay.
And as people can probably guess, that represented a significant upgrade. George Patton Jr. probably being one of the most effective U.S. combat commanders in the entire war, certainly in Europe. So changes in command and improvements in command, that's one factor. A second factor is Allies just get better at combat on the ground. They learn how to concentrate their forces. And by the way, if you read about this, there are multiple British officers who were reflecting on this and on other campaigns in Europe. They had, by the way, and these include some people who had lots of nasty things to say about the Americans. They were very, very impressed by how quickly the Americans learned.
Right. Okay.
So, and if you can learn quickly, that can make up for a lot of other deficiencies, as you might imagine. I think that's part of what saves the day here and saves the day for American forces in the bigger picture. They learn how to be more aggressive, better coordination. By the way, for example, American artillery was very capable coming into this, and they just got better and better at coordinating with some of the other branches. And especially when you get into the subsequent campaigns, this gave the Germans fits just how effective. And by the way, same with British artillery. Allied artillery may have been its most effective branch. They get no love, they get no attention. Right? It's always the armor and the infantry. Yeah. But especially if you're relying on firepower, once again, to compensate for some of your other weaknesses, you better have good artillery. And the Allies had terrific artillery forces, which start to get even better.
They get no love.
Sorry. Allied confidence starts to build with some minor victories. This is, I'll try to make this the last reference to the Patton movie. But Patton has this big victory over the German armored forces, the German 10th Panzer Division at El Gatar. It was not a very big battle, but it was one where a German attack was stopped by Americans. You know, it's similar to Guadalcanal in the Pacific, right? Once you prove that you can go toe-to-toe with the big bad guys, your morale is going to improve.
Yeah.
Right? You had been doubting yourself up to you look at something like Kasserine, it's like, wow, how are we going to be able to defeat the Germans, right? The Germans get inside your head. But once you defeat them fair and square in a battle like El Gatar, you can build on that. So Allied superiority, third factor, Allied superiority started to mount in terms of men and materiel. And I've alluded to this already in terms of firepower, but this story will repeat. The Allies in North Africa, and you're going to see it again and again, they can more than replace their losses. And they never worry, or almost never worry, about things like fuel and food and ammunition. You know, it's not just, for example, it's not just that our Rommel used to complain about this all the time, including in North Africa against Montgomery, that, you know, the British artillery is good and they never run out of shells.
Yeah.
They just keep firing. Whereas the Germans are like, okay, if I fire at this rate, I'm going to be out of shells by tomorrow morning, so I should, you know, dial it back a little bit.
Yeah.
That is not a problem. You know, we're getting to 1943 where American industry is really hitting its stride. And all this, you know, and you start to control the Atlantic in this period, and then you can just start sending more and more reinforcements and fuel and equipment and ammunition across the Atlantic and from Great Britain. So sheer firepower starts to tell on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And so by March, the Allies in Tunisia have about a 1.5 to 1 advantage in men, which is not really where you want to be, but it is a superiority. But if you look at armored fighting vehicles, if you look at tanks, their advantage is 9 to 1 by this point.
9 to 1?
9 to 1. It's something like 1,800 tanks to 200 tanks. And that's. I mean, yeah, the Germans are defending. They have anti-tank guns, but still, you do not want to be on the receiving end of a 9 to 1 ratio when it comes to armor. Once again, like I said, that can cover for a lot of other deficiencies. Your tank crews don't have to be quite as good if there are 9 of you for every one of them. So that starts to tell on the battlefield. And in its own category, I would say, is air superiority, which is established by, say, March or April. The Allies build more bases closer to the front, and they just start to deploy more aircraft.
Right.
And once you have air superiority, you can, so like in April, the Allies begin this systematic campaign against the Axis resupply effort. So a lot of all the Axis supplies are brought from Italy to Tunisia, either by ship or by aircraft.
Right.
If you have control of the air, you can start shooting down those planes, and you can start bombing the hell out of those ships. And that's exactly what the Allies do. The Allied Navy chief in the campaign, Admiral Cunningham, he was a Brit, he said famously, he ordered, and I'm quoting, "Sink, burn, capture, destroy, let nothing pass."
That's pretty comprehensive.
Pretty comprehensive, pretty unambiguous orders from the chief. And they come pretty close. I forget the exact numbers, but they come pretty close. You do not want to be an Italian merchant seaman trying to cross between Sicily and Tunisia in April 1943. Because there's a real good chance you're going to lose your life, that you're going to drown in the Mediterranean. Because a lot of those ships don't make it. And by the way, it's not just about shooting down planes and bombing ships. The Allies, with their air superiority, they start to heavily bomb Sicilian and Italian ports with their medium and heavy bombers. And by the way, this is when Italy itself starts to suffer serious physical damage for the first time. Obviously, there's going to be a whole campaign fought there, which is really going to ravage Italy. But, you know, Italians have suffered a lot, but it's all in the battlefield. It's all been in North Africa and in Albania and places like that. Italian civilians in Italian and Sicilian cities, they haven't suffered very much up until this point. But now, to try and interdict all the Axis shipping, Italy and Sicily are bombed rather heavily.
So that means the kind of peripheral strategy at this stage is already reaching into Europe proper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even before the Italian campaign has begun. Absolutely true. So what that means is very little fuel and ammunition reinforcements are making it through to Tunisia on the German and Italian side. And at the very end of the campaign, the Germans start resorting to trying to use U-boats to deliver supplies.
Oh, extremely inefficient.
This is like me trying to accomplish a major, I don't know, transshipment of goods on our highways using a bunch of Priuses.
Yeah.
I mean,
by the way, we should remind buzzkillers that Professor Nash drives a Prius.
I have never tried any major military resupply efforts.
He knows how small they are.
Although people should know my fantasy is to actually paint my Prius like a World War II American Jeep.
Okay.
Olive drab, white serial numbers, big white star on the hood. Anyway,
right. When you do that, I'll call the guys on the white.
Oh yeah,
jackets.
no, and we'll post the photo on your on your web page because I just think that'd be hilarious. Anyway, so you know, a U-boat carries something like, if you take everything out of it and cram it full of material, it can maybe 20 tons. Mm-hmm. So I mean, might as well use a kayak. I mean, it really isn't. It's not. You're not going to bring a lot of stuff. And I think even later on, they even try floating some full oil and gas drums to the beach like because they can't, in other words, they can't pull
Yeah,
into
well,
a
obviously
port
you can't.
because they'll be
Yeah.
destroyed by Allied aircraft. So just pull up on a beach or pull up near a beach somewhere and just release these barrels and hope some of them make it to the not real efficient.
Lordy.
Yeah, so the final offensive launched in mid to late April 1943. It achieves multiple breakthroughs for the reasons that I've just described. Right, finally the Allies just start to press too heavily, and the Allied lines, the Axis line starts to crack. Despite tough resistance, right? The Italians and the Germans in particular, tough resistance throughout this period. But Axis forces then start to surrender in droves, and 13 May 1943, pretty darn close to mid-April,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Axis forces capitulate.
All right, so then let me ask the ultimate question that we always want to ask on this show and in history generally. So what?
So
what does this all mean?
Who cares about Operation Torch in the Northwest? In the Northwest,
You and I do, the people involved in Operation Torch.
right? But we're
Carry.
trying to sell this to the listeners. So let me just give some of the results, sort of concrete results. Now, in case it wasn't clear from what I just said, this came at a high price. There were over 70,000 Allied casualties, so killed, wounded, and missing. That's significant. Axis losses, however, were devastating. And remember, the Axis are not in a position, in big picture, the Axis are not in a position to spare manpower the way the Allies are, as callous as that may sound. Axis losses included between 50 and 60,000 killed and wounded. Far worse are the roughly, and by the way, if you look into this, the numbers vary a lot, so a little grain of salt here. But ballpark, somewhere around 250,000 Axis troops taken prisoner.
Wow.
About half of them were German, including, like I said, some crack troops. These were were not, sort of young German reserves or sort of fresh out of boot camp and just thrust into Africa. These are some veteran divisions
Right.
that were ground up or bagged in North Africa. Goebbels, right, this is Hitler's propaganda chief, he described the defeat, the surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, and I'm quoting, he called it a second Stalingrad.
Wow.
And by the way, just in case you're wondering, the Germans, including the German leadership, had absolutely no illusions about how bad Stalingrad was. It's not like they didn't fully realize how bad Stalingrad was. They knew that, and yet he's calling it a second Stalingrad.
And he's the propaganda
It's
minister.
right.
so he's trying-
He didn't do this. He didn't do this publicly, by the way.
well, yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
he's always looking for the positive spin.
No, and and obviously he's super evil, but he was a pretty shrewd guy. I mean, historians rely on his diaries for a reason, by the way. They're an outstanding source. But the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, lost about 2,400 aircraft.
2,400?
2,400. That is a ton. That represents, and I looked this up, this represented 41% of the entire Luftwaffe at that time.
My God.
And by the way, that included a lot of transport aircraft. And if people know their history of Stalingrad was encircled by the Soviets, and then the Germans tried to keep it resupplied for several weeks by air. And one of their problems was they didn't have enough transport aircraft. That's because at that very moment,
Right.
some of those transport aircraft were busily ferrying German troops into Tunisia at the beginning of the Tunisian campaign. So all these things are connected. So Hitler's intervention, like I said, far greater than what
Sorry,
Rommel...
let me just stop you there, Professor, because that's very, very interesting. So much of what we think of as in the Russian campaign, we think of it as isolated. They're in Russia, they're getting pounded, and Stalingrad is it's a siege, but it's they end up. You forget that there are these other things going on that are directly affecting.
And the
it.
Germans are constantly shifting not minor forces, but major forces back and forth, depending on how one campaign or the other is going. There's one point, I believe it was in 1942, where the Germans transferred an entire air fleet to Italy. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why, briefly, things go really, really well for Rommel, is because he has this massive infusion of new aircraft at his disposal. And then later on, they're taken away again. Back to the Eastern Front. And so, you're absolutely right. And I think it does get overlooked. We tend to look at these fronts in isolation, but they're often connected, including later, by the way. And we'll talk about this, you'll remind me, in the context of the Italian campaign, because it's one of the reasons why the Germans call off their offensive at Kursk in July 1943 in Russia. It's because they have to rush reinforcements to Italy. So these things are absolutely right. These things are connected. But 2,400 aircraft is a lot. In some ways, their aircraft losses are sort of the worst aspect of this, especially all the transport aircraft. So Hitler's intervention, despite the fact that, like I said, it's too late to help Rommel, it would have been those troops would have done much greater things for the Axis in the larger scheme had they come in 1942 in Libya and Egypt. But this did delay the Allied seizure of all North Africa by about 6 months.
Okay.
And it kept the Mediterranean closed, therefore, for those additional 6 months and delayed the invasion of Italy. The Allied plan was for Torch to be fast over by, say, Christmas of 1942, and then you can invade Italy in the spring of 1942. Sicily, that is. Sorry, in the spring of 1943.
Yeah.
As opposed to when it actually took place. Operation Husky is not going to come until July, which is actually kind of impressive. So it set back their timetable, but not as much as you might think. But still, this did delay Allied forces. The question is, did this delay matter that much? You probably still would have had no D-Day invasion overlord until the summer of 1944. So in that case, maybe it doesn't matter that much. Also, the Axis losses in manpower and equipment, I guess, it's a matter of taste. But the Axis losses in manpower and equipment probably weren't worth that 6-month delay. If you, for example, had you had all those forces available to defend Sicily and Italy, because as we're going to see, Sicily is actually pretty lightly defended.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons is a lot of the Germans who might have defended it were in Allied holding pens. Right. Because and the war is over for them. So there were other effects. Rick Atkinson, I think I'm going to recommend his book for the bookshelf for this episode.
Okay.
Rick Atkinson has written a superb, it's a few years old now, but a superb trilogy on the American war in Europe, which I cannot recommend highly enough. My anecdote about those American tankers blowing up all those planes, that was from his book, among other things here.
Okay.
He points out very usefully at the end that among other side effects of this successful campaign is that the French were able to brutally reimpose their control over North Africa. And Axis propaganda had been very successful in winning the allegiance of a lot of Arab people who had suffered under French colonialism, right? In places in places like Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. And so the French come back in and they are super paranoid and super resentful about the slightest sign that Arabs may have collaborated with the Germans. And so the French exact a sort of swift retribution and they brutally reimpose their control. They abuse and imprison and even execute large numbers of North Africans who, and I think that's often overlooked, right? We always talk about liberation, right? This was liberated from the Axis or was liberated from the Vichy French. If you're an Arab living in Algeria, for the French showing up again, that's not cause for celebration. I mean, now, your life wasn't good during when war was being fought around you, and the Germans didn't necessarily, in reality, treat you very well, but you don't feel liberated. The status quo has been reestablished, so it's always worth keeping that. To the extent that this is an imperial war, right? And not
right.
Empires
versus empire. Yeah,
it's often overlooked and always worth remembering. In this case, in North Africa, Eisenhower definitely grew as a commanding officer. He was wilier, more authoritative, tougher with subordinates. And as Atkinson also points out, Eisenhower, and I was wondering about this, maybe there's a slight parallel with Ulysses S. Grant, but that Eisenhower learns the necessity of sacrificing young men. That if you're going to go toe-to-toe with the ruthless enemy, you need to be ruthless too, and you need some toughness, and you need some hate in your heart, and Eisenhower and his men start to acquire these. It's also important that at this point, the United States Army now has 4 veteran divisions who have been in combat against the Germans for a month. That is invaluable experience. You can multiply that out, right? The lessons you learn, right, in terms of battlefield tactics, what works, what doesn't. Word of that can spread as you retrain your other forces for subsequent operations.
Oh, okay, I see.
Right, and so no, it's just not just about these 4 divisions. Which, like for example, the Big Red One, the First Infantry Division, is a great outfit that goes on to win a lot of laurels. But it's not just about them; it's about what these folks learn and how this spreads through the entire U.S. Army, and also additional lessons won by Commonwealth forces as well. So, in terms of strategy and how the war was fought, in terms of like the sequence of campaigns, in hindsight, I can't think of any serious historian disagreeing with this. Roosevelt and the British were clearly right. The Allies were not ready to tackle the Germans head-on in mainland Europe in 1942. I'm pretty sure that would have been a disaster. And there were some insurmountable technical issues, like for example, shortage of landing craft.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Higgins boats that haven't been built yet, and that takes time. And also, from another angle, Germany needed to be weakened first. Overlord is successful because the Germany of 1944 is not the Germany of late 1942. There's just no comparison. Germany's ability to wage war has been significantly degraded by the summer of 1944, and you needed subsidiary operations like North Africa to help degrade them.
Right.
Now, In case
Right.
people haven't listened to our Eastern Front episodes, they should know that the major league degrading
Yeah,
is being
right,
done by
right.
the Red Army in this time period. But Germany needed to be reduced in strength.
Yeah, this
for
is
some-
not insignificant.
Yeah, no. And so in that sense, it's super important to have this lesser campaign where you can learn how to fight, weed out your commanders, gain your own strength while the enemy starts to get worn down. I would say in retrospect, Operation Torch happening when it did was a shrewd move, despite the weaknesses in its execution. And there were all sorts of executions, some of which I alluded to. And now with May 1943, you've secured North Africa. Now you can turn your eyes north toward Europe.
And that's what we're going to do with the next show in this series, The Leap to Europe. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Dr. Nash.
Always a pleasure.
And we will talk to all of you buzzkillers out there next week.